It is my pleasure to welcome Rabbi Alex Israel for the second of his presentations on the Passover preparation. Rabbi.
Okay, so welcome back, everybody. Delighted to see you all. And last time we studied what I called the Midreshet of the four sons, or the four children. And we did something very simple. We looked at all the sources of the four sons, and we showed that, in fact, the four sons is far from the pshat, far from the meaning of the text, that the main points of this whole passage is to encourage, to engage with each person according to their place in life, according to their personality, and that's what we're trying to do. So today we're going to revisit the four sons. Next week, we're going to look at not four sons, but we're going to look at four women of the Exodus, because this is so often translated as the four sons. I think it behooves us to turn our attention to very deliberately feminine characters. And so we're going to do that next week. That will be more of a Tanakh class. But today will be, if last time was a Midrash and Bible class, today, or rabbinics class, today will be a Jewish philosophy and contemporary philosophy class, because we're going to look at contemporary readings of the four sons. So let's just begin. We are going to we just mentioned before Rabbi Sachs, so we're going to start off with a little bit of Rabbi Sachs, but here we go. I hope people can see the sheets. I hope it's big enough for everybody. I put the text of the Haggadah here, just so that we can refer to it if we need to. But I assume that everybody has seen this passage before, right? The four children, one wise, one wicked, a simple child, and a child who doesn't know how to ask. And my question today is going to be, can we find virtues? Usually we look at the wise one as the good one, and everybody else not so good. You might be aware of people who have sometimes related to these as four generations, right? One generation is the wise, then there is the wicked child who rejects the father's teaching, maybe after emigrating, and then the simple child, he has an ability to ask because he sees what goes on in his grandfather's house, or he has a sense of what his father's rebelling about. But the fourth generation is already the child who does not know how to ask. I think it was Chabad, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who said there is a fifth child, and that is the child who is not at the Seder, and that is our responsibility to make sure that we invite him. So, okay, it might be, in which case they are how should we call it, a sliding scale. They are what we might call a spectrum. They are on a sliding scale. So we're going to examine today some different conceptions of how to relate to the other children, not just the wise child, but the others. I want to again start off with something that I mentioned last time, but I think it bears emphasizing, and that is Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the necessity of asking questions. I'm just going to read this with you. That the Pesach narrative, and this is the continuation from last time's class. The Pesach narrative, he says, must be constructed in response to and begin with questions by a child. It's the duty of a parent to encourage his or her children to ask questions, and the child who does not yet know how to ask should be taught to ask. There is nothing natural about this, and this is the bit that I love so much. To the contrary, it goes against the grain of history. Most traditional cultures see the task of a parent or teacher to instruct, guide, or command. The task of the child is to obey. Children should be seen and not heard, goes the English proverb. Children, be obedient to your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord, says the famous Christian text. Socrates, who spent his life teaching people to ask questions, was condemned by the citizens of Athens for correcting the young. In Judaism, the opposite is the case. It is a religious duty to teach our children to ask questions. This is how they grow. And he says, Judaism is the rarest phenomena, a faith based on asking questions, sometimes deep and difficult ones that seem to shake the very foundation of faith itself. Shall the judge of earth not do justice, asked Abraham. Why, Lord, have you brought trouble on this people, asked Moses. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do the faithless live at ease, asked Jeremiah. The book of Job is largely constructed out of questions, and God's answer consists of 4 chapters of yet deeper questions. So I just couldn't resist that passage, that we are a people of questions, and it's not just about the Seder. And I will never forget a day when I was in yeshiva. I've been in yeshiva for almost 2 years, and we came to Shiur one day, and our Gemara teacher had a huge smile on his face. And we said to him, Rabbi, why are you so happy today? And he said, because today I answered a question that I've had for 8 years. Now, remember, we were 18, 19-year-old students. 8 years sounded like an eon ago. And we said, you've really had a question for 8 years? And he said to all of us, he said, listen, huddle up, he says. I want to tell you guys, if you have a good question, never give it a bad answer. Because if you have a bad answer, you'll close it off, and then you'll be living with a bad answer. Always leave a good question as a good question. And one day you'll find the answer. And last night, I found an answer to one of those questions, and look at the smile on my face. And I have to say, I took that so to heart. And I've actually had that experience as well. And now I can also say to my students, this is a question I've had for 15 years. This is a question I've had for 8 years. Better to give no answer to a good question, leave it open, continue to mull it over, think about it, than give a bad answer to a good question. So we've got the sons, or the children, we've got the questions, and I'm going to start off today with some Israeli poetry. And this is a piece of Israeli poetry. I'm just going to glance down the year, because I forgot, 1951. This is a column, the newspaper, if you can imagine. I'm just checking my internet here, because okay, I'm actually
You've frozen, unfortunately.
Broadcast on the best location. Have a problem, be right back. What did you say?
You froze for the last 10 seconds, audio and visual, but now you're back.
Great, fantastic. So I'll start again. We're going to look at some Israeli poetry, and in particular, we're going to look at somebody called Natan Alterman. Natan Alterman wrote this poem in 1951. Now, Natan Alterman was a leading columnist in the Davar newspaper, the labor newspaper, and the newspaper was a broadsheet. I don't know if they have them anymore. So many of our newspapers, even the London Times has become a tabloid size, but the big newspapers. And it was divided into 7 columns. And every Friday, he wrote a column. He wrote a poem which took up an entire column in the 7th column. And therefore it was called Hator Hashvi'i, the 7th column. Can you imagine? That was his literary output. But everybody used to read it because it wasn't so much a poem as a sort of an op-ed and a political commentary. And this is Natan Alterman, really the center of the labor movement. Probably today we'd call him center-right even, maybe. He had a lot of critique of the labor leadership. Whenever he saw moral failings, he would point them out. He was a bit like a prophet. Anyway, this is just a lovely, lovely poem, which was published, let me just look at the date, obviously before Pesach, okay, the 20th of April, 1951, on Erev Pesach, Yud Daled Nisan, Tafshin Yud Aleph. And this is what he has to say. We'll take a little look, maybe I'll read some of it even in Hebrew, because How can you read a Hebrew poetry without hearing the resonance of the Hebrew? And he says, it starts off with Echad Tam. There was a simple one. This species is almost extinct. We are all wise, right? You get that? Lovely. So he says, Echad Tam, there was a simple man. Haminazeh Afes. This species is extinct. Kulanu Chachamim. Ach kanireh hayazeh lo mashal shel stam. Kayom ulai kasher bekach la'amin, aval haya epam echad tam. Apparently, it was no random tale. Nowadays, maybe it is difficult to believe, but there was once upon a time a simple man. Muzar haya ish. Kol am yotzei migoshen ra'u et ha'otot v'amoftin ba'ayin. Ra'u et hamakot v'nachash hanachoshet. Ra'u et haharim shenazlu mayim. This man was strange. All those who left Goshen saw the signs and wonders in full sight, saw the plagues and the copper serpent, saw the hills which oozed water. This phrase, Harim Nazlu Mayim, is actually from I assume he's referring to hitting the rock, but it's a phrase actually from Shirat Devorah. Barishana. So they all saw these things, but Barishana Yomdim B'Kenifamim. At the beginning, they stood there amazed. And they even dropped the pots they were holding. They dropped the pan from their hands. Aval chishkal. But quickly, tafsu zetevayamim. Very quickly, they concluded, this is the nature of the days. Zesidram, v'kach na'eh, v'kach ya'eh. Right? Listen to the Hebrew. Kach na'eh, kach ya'eh. Kilo na'eh, kilo ya'eh. Right? He's playing around with it. This is the norm. It's fitting and appropriate. Indeed, from the moment they left Ramses, they began to wonder about a day in which there was no miracle. Not so this mythic man, our Ishtam, who was counted among the family of Kahat. You needed to see that Tam, that short, simple man, his eyes wide open, when the sea split. He looked incredulous, his body erect. And what did he say? Rak mazotu amar. He said, what is this? Kitam mahu omer. Because after all, what does the simple man say? Afei tarim ragdu mineged keilim. Right? You remember, but say Israel Mitzrayim. When the hills dance like rams, they say he almost went out his mind. And two of the officers of hundreds who distributed equipment reported that he even spoke of Zionism. This man Why should we prattle on? This man was unhinged as if outside time. But if his eyes had not seen what they saw, and if his heart had not known what it knew, it would be difficult to imagine, even in fleeting thought, what might have remained from the entire legend. And of course, what's the last phrase? What would be left from the whole Haggadah, right? Haggadah, the legend. This is a lovely little poem, where basically what's he saying? He's saying, look, you've got everybody else accepts the fact that their life has become full of miracles. They came out of Egypt, the sea splits, they get manna every morning. They get water from a rock, and everybody, what do they say? Why do you bring us out of Egypt? Right? Everybody gets used to what do they do? Everybody complains. He says, he takes the image of the Tam, the simple man who says, Ma zot, wow, what is this? And he sees the simple man as almost having a sense of wonder, his eyes wide open, his mouth aghast. And here we have the person who is Tam. He's simple, but he's, how should we call this? In a state of amazement, in a state of wonder. And of course, he is not just talking about Yetziat Mitzrayim, or I'd even argue he is not primarily talking of Yetziat Mitzrayim. He knows everybody is going to be sitting at a Seder. But much like if you've been following the news in Israel today, we are a nation who like arguing, if you haven't noticed. We are a nation who have our arguments, and what's going on in Israel at the moment with our big debate. We're going to solve it, this debate about the legal system. But in the meantime, it gets very, very acrimonious. And what he's saying is, imagine it's 1951, there is still rationing, immigrants are beginning to come, and Olim Vatikim are saying, is this what we dreamed of? And he's saying, let's absorb a little bit the sensibility of the Tam, the sense of wonderment, the sense of incredulousness, that look what we are living through. Look at these incredible days that we are living through. We're living miracles, and let's not forget that. And that's what he's saying to the people who, in his newspaper on that Erev Pesach, don't be despondent, don't complain. We're living a miracle every day. So, Echad Tam, right? So I've got to say, I just love this. But let's think about what he's in fact saying here. Before I mentioned that maybe we can have a scale. You have the Chacham, who's clearly an intellectual. You have the Rasha, who's also pretty intelligent. Then you get to the Tam, and we imagine the Tam is simple. And when we hear simple, we imagine lacking intellectual ability. And then the She'ein Olo Dei Shol, we saw the images last week, which is frequently a little child who, what can he ask? He's not sophisticated. And then we get the image of the Tam who says, Mazot, what is this? He's not sophisticated. What Altman is trying to do is turn this on its head and say that the Tam has a sense of naivete. He has a sense of wonderment. He has a sense of amazement. And that is what he's about. Now, so first of all, it's just lovely. It's lovely to hear the poetry, right? It's lovely to hear how he says, this species is extinct because today kulanu chachamim, right? We are all chachamim, and all those other phrases where he says, he says, v'kach na'eh, v'kach ya'eh. Okay, enough Israeli poetry. Let's go to some other people. And we, in a minute, are going to go to Rabbi Norman Lamb, who I'm sure you know, if I heard of him, who was the head of Yeshiva University. But before we get there, I want to deal with a few opposites. And we're going to do this with the help of the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Eretz Hatzvi, a very, very creative writer and thinker, Rav Yaakov Meidan. And he says like this: in many of the illustrations found in traditional Haggadot, the four sons are divided into two groups: the wise son versus the wicked son, and the simple son versus the son who doesn't know how to ask. Okay, so we've got the wise son who seems to accept everything, the Eidut and the Chukim and the Mishpatim, all the laws, and we give him a very, very detailed answer. And you've got the wicked son who rejects all of that. And then you've got the simple versus the son who doesn't know how to ask. He cites the wise son and the wicked son are perceived as opposites because we identify the wise son with a righteous one and the true opposite of the wicked son. Then the simple son is portrayed as stupid, and the son who doesn't know how to ask is depicted as even stupider than the simple son. But he says then, what is the meaning of this division? And he says, maybe we've got it wrong. So let's take a look. He said, in the Talmud Yerushalmi, the third son is not referred to as the simple one, but rather the stupid one. Gosh, that's not so nice. Rabbi Chia said the Torah speaks of four sons: a wise son, a wicked son, a stupid son, and a son who doesn't know how to ask. Now this changes the paradigm. Yerushalmi applies in a much clearer fashion the wording about Haggadot. The wise son opposite mate is not the wicked son, but rather the stupid son. So in other words, wise, intellectual, and tipesh, low intellect. But then who is the other opposite? The Rasha is the opposite of the she'eni yodeh lishol. So we're going to have to play with those, and he will in a second. So he wants to put it according to this table that you see in front of you: wise and stupid, wicked, and don't know how to ask. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But having said that, that game of opposites that we're looking at, I want you to go to Rabbi Norman Lamb, who is going to say this. He's going to organize it differently as well. He says, intellectually, I hope you can see. Yeah, people can see. If you want, we can make sure these sheets are also sent out. Actually, I wonder if I can put it in the chat. Hold on a second. Chat. See if I can. 1 minute. File. You know, I'm just going to actually, give me half a second. I'm going to put this. So this is hopefully in the chat now. And I hope you'll be able to pick it up from there if you want to actually download the sheets. And then you can keep it and you can look up the original articles, which I put links to the relevant things. Let's read Rabbi Lamb, because I think Rabbi Lamb is amazing. Let's take a look. Intellectually, he says, the Chacham, who's the opposite of the Chacham? According to him, the she'eni yodeh lishol. The first is wise, the second, foolish. Then, however, there is the criteria of contact. Here, the Rasha and Tam are counterposed. So he says, if you go intellectually, the way he wants to do it is he says you've got Chacham is wise, she'eni yodeh lishol is clearly not intelligent. So now Rasha and Tam are counterposed. The first is wicked, the second good. And now he says like this: the Tam is not the opposite of the Chacham, but of the Rasha. Okay? That Tam is a complementary word, and he's going to be the continuation of Natan Altman. See, even the fact that Father Yaakov was called Tam. Do you remember? Yaakov Avinu is called Yaakov Ish Tam Yoshev Ohalim. Yaakov is a simple man living in tents. So, and the Talmud's term for an animal that is benevolent rather than dangerous or murderous is Shor Tam. Tam means, so he says the Tam is not simple or foolish, but the wholesome son, the pious and good and obedient one. Thus, while the Tam is the opposite of Rasha, he's also different from the one who cannot ask. While the latter is childish, the former is childlike. I love this. While the latter is infantile, the Tam is simple. And what a noble virtue simplicity is. Listen to this lovely line now. The Chavetz Chaim and the Chazon Ish and others were brilliant scholars, but they exuded simplicity. Despite all the praise we heap on the wise son, he isn't unblemished. For some strange reason, which may go into the unconscious of our race, there's always been an instinctive element of suspicion about the Chacham. Witness the sarcasm, right? And he seems to be, when we look at the Chacham in the Haggadah, he seems how can I say it? Can I say a little sarcastic, a little smug, a little too full of himself. Maha'idut v'chukim v'mishpatim. Now look at the lovely way he's going to bring Rav Nachman Mibratzlav. And he says, one of the greatest of all Hasidic teachers, the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, Rav Nachman Mibratzlav, put it this way: Achar kol ha'chochmot, after all the wisdom, one ought to discard all his sophistication and turn to the Lord in order to serve him bitminut of a pshitut gamor, in utter wholesomeness and simplicity. Beli shum chochmot. Actually, it's a very interesting statement. After all the wisdom, in other words, you're already wise, but with utter wholesomeness and simplicity, beli shum chochmot, without any awareness of being wise. The greatest chochmah of all is livli liyot chacham klal, not to be wise at all. For in fact, there's a complete wise person in the world. There is no complete wise person in the world. For man's wisdom is still as naught compared to that of the Creator. Va'ikarhu, and the main thing is Rahmana libabai, that God wants man's heart, not assuredly in the American Jew's sense of the good heart, excusing one from living like a Jew, but in the sense of an emotional, spiritual deepening of the experience and practice of mitzvot. Hasidism is unimpressed by intellectual acrobatics. It prefers heart over mind, faith over philosophy, dedication over dialectics, love over learning. The third son, the Tam, is thus regarded as even greater than the first, the Chacham. And now Rabbi Norman Lamb says, can such a point of view be accepted today? I believe so, he says. As society in general suffers from an overabundance of knowledge at the expense of man's wholeness, his self, his integrity. By the way, I think this is even more true after the internet. Science reigns supreme, and colleges are impossibly crowded. Knowledge is universal. Knowledge is the key to a better job and more convenient society as power in the world of international relations. All of this is unquestionably true. Yet when the mind and its achievements are so stressed that all else is excluded, the man is considered a machine whose loves and hates and fears and passions and aspirations are trivial, then we've outsmarted ourselves. The man, the human, is in eclipse. He's like a freak child with an abnormally large head and an undersized body and heart. What a great phrase. It's not enough to emphasize the Chacham alone. You can hear him preaching. For a while, it's true that wisdom is indispensable both to life and Jewish living. It's equally true that beyond all the complexities and subtleties that tantalize man's mind and confound his understanding, there stands the simple and sublime truth of the one God, author of all. What we need is the Tam, one who can include wisdom in his personality and transcend it. He's not the Oiber Chacham, as we might call it, right? Not the Oiber Chacham. He's a person who can possess scholarship without displaying pretentiousness, who can develop his intellect, and yet, in the moment he turns to God, abandon his self-consciousness and serve his maker with wonder and simplicity, with love and faith, right? So this might be true in any age. I also find it interesting that, Rabbi Lamb was a rabbi in a shul in Manhattan, right? Where I think you frequently can encounter certain sort of types who do give the impression of, high intellect, but don't necessarily put a premium on those qualities that wonder and simplicity, love and faith. Maybe things have changed now. I think there's a resurgence of, call it mindfulness or what have you, but that is something that he wants to say. Okay, let's keep moving. What we've basically done so far is we've championed the Tam. The Tam, and by the way, Chassidut does this a lot, that the Tam is the simple son, is seen as the person, the Emunah Pshuta, the simple faith, and all. So let's try and also characterize some of the other children and see what we can say about them and see how we do. So we saw Rav Meidan, and Rav Meidan wants to now say that the difference is the wicked child and the child who doesn't know how to ask. So I'd like to sort of play around with this wicked child a little bit and see what we can say about him. So let's see where we go. And he asks the question at the bottom of page 4. Why does the wicked son ask specifically about the Korban Pesach? And now he says something brilliant, Rav Meidan. He says, it would seem the objective of the Paschal Lamb is not only to remember the exodus from Egypt. The Mechilza raised the possibility that a Gentile who converts to Judaism must offer a Paschal Lamb when he becomes obligated in the mitzvot. So it's not just about the exodus. Apparently, the Paschal Lamb is about acceptance of mitzvot. And now look at the list he says. He says, a Paschal Lamb was brought by the people who returned to Zion from the exile in Babylonia. He brings you the place in Book of Ezra. And there, a new covenant was made with God. The Book of Chronicles describes the Paschal sacrifice brought by King Hezekiah. Okay? After you moved idols and altars from his father Achaz. Similarly, King Josiah, Yoshiyahu, brought a Paschal offering after he made a new covenant with the people, and God removed the abominations of Manasseh and Ammon from Jerusalem in the temple. In other words, what is Korban Pesach? Korban Pesach isn't just to remember the Exodus. Korban Pesach is an expression of commitment to God. From all these sources, it seems Pesach is the commemorative festival. The Paschal offering gives expression to a new covenant made between God and his people. The wicked son's question does not stem from lack of knowledge about ancient history. His question is found to the current covenant within his own generation. And therefore the wicked son is saying, Maha avodah zot lachem, right? Why do you need this commitment? And therefore he says something fabulous. And now listen to this. Do you remember the Midrash? There's a Midrash that when God wanted to give the Torah to the Jewish people, he went from place to place, from nation to nation. And he turned around to one nation and he says, would you like my Torah? And they said, what's in it? And they said, well, you're not allowed to kill. I think he went to Ishmael. You're not allowed to kill. And he said, not kill? Huh. Well, I like doing that, so I'm not in. And he goes to another one and says, you can't steal. He says, can't steal? That's what we do for a living. I'm out. He went to another one and said, you can't commit adultery. And they said, sure, that's what we do. I'm not doing that. 10 commandments. And then he came to Israel. And what did Israel say? Na'aseh v'nishma. Right? So let's take a look. He says, I'll just read. The fourth son who does not know how to ask is ordinarily perceived as a child who does not understand. Only we relate to with forgiveness and compassion. However, the principle we put forward regarding the pairs of offices, opposites, which sets the son who does not know how to ask against the wicked son, brings us to a reevaluation of the nature of this son. I remind you of the story of the father who wished to give the Torah to his children. He offered his Torah to the first three sons, but they all asked, what is written in it? They were all the Chacham, right? Or the Rasha, and they found some issue that did not accord with their character. When he offered the Torah to his fourth son, he asked nothing. Am Israel are the she'eno yodea lish'ol. And immediately they said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will obey. The son was the people of Israel at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Refraining from asking questions need not be interpreted as stupidity. It can be also understood as belief and readiness. The fourth son is the righteous believer. Here, Rav Meidan is basically expressing that we should celebrate, we are the She'eno Yodea Lishol. What is the She'eno Yodea Lishol? It's not so much wonder and amazement, it's not simplicity, it is acceptance. That the Jewish people have been willing, and by the way, I say this around Pesach time, where Jews suffered so badly around Easter, around Pesach time, with blood libels and what have you, with the crucifixion, time of Easter, and Jews being blamed for it. And Jews said, come what may, we are going to be loyal to who we are. We are, Rabbi Sachs wrote a beautiful piece about the notion of Am Kshe Oref, the Jewish people as a stubborn people. And God says, right, I will forgive them because they're stubborn people. And he says, what? Why is that a reason to forgive? And Rabbi Sachs says, because Jews have been tenacious. They have been obstinate in their commitment to God. So for Rav Meidan, the She'enu Yodea Lishol isn't because he cannot ask questions, it's that he will not ask questions. He has accepted his role as a Jew, no conditions. He has accepted his role as a Jew because that is who he is. And that's a really, really powerful thing. So it's really fascinating that for Rav Meidan, you have the Chacham, the intelligent one, the Tam, the stupid one, but the axis of the Rasha and the She'enu Yodea Lishol is not about intelligence. It's more about repudiation of the covenant or acceptance of the covenant. And at some point, acceptance doesn't come with conditions, it comes without any conditions. So I find this a fascinating characterization of the She'eno Yodea Lishol. Okay, it's time to deal a little bit with the Rasha. Okay, we've dealt with the Tam, we've dealt with the She'eno Yodea Lishol, and as you can see, what I'm trying to do is to give you surprising and positive characterizations of each of the children. Now, that's a very difficult thing to do with the Rasha. How are you going to come up with a positive characterization of the Rasha? So I'm going to deal with the explanation of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe is going to relate both to the Rasha, if you can see here, and further down the page, he's going to talk about the child who won't ask. And these are both stunning interpretations, even though I have to say, well, this one is very midrashic, the one he's dealing with here. The second one is going to be quite psychological. Let's see. The Talmud says that a Jew, Yisrael afal pi shechata Yisraelhu, right? That a Jew, even though he sinned, is still a Jew. In every situation a Jew finds himself, there's always a Jew inside the Jew. However far we have strayed, we are always Jewish. And now he quotes his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, who says that the phrase here in the Haggadah is Echad Chacham ve'Echad Rasha. Why doesn't it the Echad? Hashem, 1 minute. Can you hear me? You can give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Are we good? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you. So Echad Chacham, Echad, who's the Echad? The Echad is Echad Eloheinu Shebashamayim U'Ba'aretz. It's Hashem Echad. So that phrase in every single person, B'chol Echad Yesh Nekudat Echad Gam Eisal Rasha. Even the Rasha, and by the way, of course, we all know that frequently when you see people who are rebelling against their Judaism, they are so full of their Judaism. Right? They're not religious, but they talk Torah the whole time because it's in them, they're fighting against it, right? They're more engaged. They're engaged in a negative in a not an attraction, but maybe a repulsion. But they are engaged. So he says this is true with the wicked son, but the godliness is hidden. We need to bring it out. And now he says a lovely drush. What do we say about him? We say, were he in Egypt, he would never have been redeemed. And the intent is not, God forbid, to drive him away. Rather, we say, Ilu haya sham lo haya nigal. If he was in Egypt, he wouldn't have been redeemed. In other words, in Egypt, in the environment of Egypt, it's not working for him. But at Mount Sinai, God spoke to each person. And he said, I am the Lord your God. Anochi Hashem Eloheh Cha. Eloheh Cha. I am the Lord your God, your singular, in accordance with your energy, your individuality, your inner essence. Right? In other words, what he says is, if you want to talk to, the theme of the Rasha is all about Azot Lachem. What is this to you? And we say, Lachem v'lo lo, right? He doesn't want to be part of the collective. So what does the Lubavitcher Rebbe's father-in-law say? If he doesn't like the collective, we need to deal with him individually. He needs individual attention. He needs to find a religion that works for him. And if we find the religion that works for him, then that will work very well. If you don't mind me, I'm just going to tell you an interesting story that happened to me once. I go on lecture tours through America, and I went to a certain campus in upstate New York to give some shiurim. Waiting for me there were two of my previous students I had taught in yeshiva, and they came to meet me. Now, I'm not so tall, and one of the guys there was 6 foot. When I met him, I thought, is he wearing a kippah? Is he not wearing a kippah? But very soon I realized he really wasn't, and this was a little surprising for me. To me, I'm off the derech. I said, what does that mean, you're off the derech? He said, well, I'm not religious anymore. So come and meet his rabbi. That so I turned to him and I said, Friday night, what do you do? So he says, what do you mean? What do I do? I go to Chabad. I said, you just said you're not religious. He says, yeah, I don't pray. I go to Chabad to hang out with all the Jews. Then I ask him, what does he do during the week? Is he connected to other religious Jews? And he says, yeah, I have a chavruta every week. It's a Gemara, and I still am with my Gemara chavruta from Yeshiva, and I only really hang out with Orthodox Jews. I said to this young man, this young student, I said to him, listen, I don't know what you mean when you say you're off the derech, yeah? I don't know what derech you're talking about. As far as I'm concerned, you're on the derech, you're on your derech, right? You're on your derech, your journey, and there's something about your Judaism that isn't working for you. If you stay on the derech, maybe you'll be able to find your way forward. And that's what the Babasha Rebbe is saying here, right? In accordance with your energy, your individuality, your inner essence. That's what you have to find. Anochi Hashem Elohecha, not as part of the, but as part of as an individual. If we look at the child who won't ask, let's just take a look at this passage. And here, what does he say here? He says, Haben she'ena sho'el. Oh, did I translate? Yeah, here we go. The child who does not know how to ask cannot appreciate the talk and exodus from above. This is fascinating. He says, what did he ask? He's on the periphery. And the Rebbe imagines him as somebody who doesn't like the idea of the supernatural. He doesn't like the phrase, God brought us out from Egypt. He says to him, we must speak about how a person, I'll show you the Hebrew as well. We must speak about how a person being needs to leave Egypt. What's the pasuk with the Ba'avur zeh asah Hashem li b'tzeiti mimitzrayim, when I left Egypt. In other words, where does he put the emphasis? It's not about whether God took us out of Egypt, it's about whether I came out of Egypt. Open for him. What do you open? You need to open the way to leave Egypt personally. That Egypt represents the notion of a person leaving his limitations, not the power of faith in the divine, above all human intelligence. So what's he saying here? He's saying that sometimes the she'eno yodeh lishol is not somebody who doesn't know how to ask. He's somebody who is unwilling to ask. He's unwilling to ask because he doesn't believe in all of this miracles and wonders. But the point isn't whether God brought us out. The point is that everybody has Mitzrayim to leave. Everybody has constraints, limitations that they need to confront in life. That is the experience that we need on Pesach, to move beyond ourselves. So he says, what's the answer to the She'enu Yodeh Shol? Patachlo, and you say, Ba'avur zeh Hashem li b'tzeiti mimitzrayim, right? Don't worry about the God bit. Worry about you. You leave your constraints. You leave your space. Go find a new space. Find what's wrong. Found this a lovely, compassionate read that he's saying that sometimes we don't have a question because we're not willing to engage, but we can find a way to engage. And the last thing I'd like to share with you in this kaleidoscope of Hasidic readings, the Sfat Emet. And the Sfat Emet says, the Torah spoke about 4 sons. It seems that these 4 sons, Nireh, Shehu, Keneged, Arba, Shagula Hayam Mikola Arba Galuyot, and the has to be from all 4 exiles. Okay, and then what does he say here? He says, B'she'ilot halal. Every person in Israel. What's he saying? We're all a chacham. In certain things, we really engage with certain spots, and we want to know more about them. In certain areas of our Judaism, we are a Rasha. In certain things, we don't keep or we don't like. We're unhappy with them. In certain areas, we are a tam. In certain areas, we are she'enu de'elishol. I love this idea that the four sons are four voices inside ourselves. And this is typical Hasidic thinking. But let's take a look and we'll read a little bit. He says, all these questions person due to our musings, where the evil inclination calls us to ask questions, the laws. So the first one is the Chacham, where we question the law. Each of us must have answers ready in our heart. When he says tshuva, I don't know whether he means repentance or answers, because the act of greater logic and joy than understanding the reason for a mitzvah. So what does he say? He says, what do we ask about the law? Explain me the law. But what's the answer we give? We don't eat anything after eating the Pesach sacrifice. The mitzvah of matzah doesn't have very much of a taste at all, but it's tastier than all other foods. So he says, you don't need to understand everything, right? The idea is just to let the taste linger. The Russia, he says, rejects the yoke of Judaism. He says, why this service? And he says, for you. By what basis does God want human beings, flesh and blood, to serve him? In other words, interesting reading. He says, Ma avodah lachem. Who's lachem? Lachem means, why does, he's asking theologically. God doesn't need human beings. God doesn't need our sacrifices, our prayer. And the answer, and what a lovely answer. For this, God brought us out. God values the service of human beings more than the worship of angels. You don't know the effect. God loves humanity. Simple Son is as mazot. What is this? And how does he read this? The simple Son is when God gives to human beings, and the Tam in his arrogance says, what's that? What sort of a gift is that? I've got a car, but why is it a 5-year-old car? I should have the latest car. I've got a phone, but why have I got this bashed up phone? I should have the latest iPhone. And we must remember that everything is given with divine grace, by a mighty hand, by kindness of God. We deserve it. And the child who does not ask is the child in bitter galut. We can't even open our hearts. We don't even have a question. Thus the Haggadah says, open to him, right? Open to him. And for this, he says, for this we give praise. Redemption from Egypt encompasses all the 4 exiles and all these types. By the way, what does he mean by all the 4 exiles? He means, we talk about the Babylonian exile, the Persian exile, the Greek exile, and the Roman exile. It might well be that indeed these questions correspond to each of these things, right? Is the intellectual, and the Persian is the question of hashgacha, etc. Whichever way, redemption from Egypt encompasses all the 4 exiles, and these types are found in each and every one of us. These are called sons because they are the construction. Banim, from the word binyan, right? Al tikra banayich el bonayich, right? Because they're the construction of each and every one through our intellectual and emotional stirrings. So, what I hope I've done is to show you the way, in fact, the 4 sons has been used throughout the Hasidic masters as sort of like sociological, intellectual, emotional landscape to sort of examine, different modes of interaction and engagement with Judaism. And we're all being invited to be at the table, and we're all being invited to find a way forward. The questions are answered with empathy, with openness, and even the way that the Lubavitcher Rebbe answers the Rush is not like what we hear in the Seder, which is kick his teeth in. But he's like saying, the guy's got a problem, so let's address it, okay? And nobody here is the bad child. So I hope this has given you some food for thought. Maybe even as the Sfat Emet says, you can identify some of those children in you. And we will leave it here for today. And please God, next time, we will take up our theme of not the 4 sons, but the 4 women of the Exodus. and we'll meet again, same time, same place next week.
Yesher Koyach. Beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to leave it here. Thank you very much. Okay.